Hi. So I'd like to discuss today uh, the expansion and recent reforms with public employee unions. So the growth of public employee unions occurred later than the growth of private sector unions. Even politicians who supported uh, the workers' right to negotiate wages and benefits in the private sector didn't used to support the workers' rights in the public sector to do so. Uh, for one of the reasons that you still hear today, that public employees negotiate against local governments. So instead of having a private sector employer negotiating wages and benefits where those wages are going to cut into profit margins, public employees are negotiating against oftentimes elected officials, school boards, local government officials, and one of the arguments against having public sector unions is that you are negotiating for taxpayer dollars, and that it's one thing to negotiate over the profits of the company, and who gets what shares. It's another thing to negotiate over tax money. So there was opposition to public sector collective bargaining for decades before there was finally some kind of expansion. The uh, public sector collective bargaining uh, started like formally with formal collective bargaining rights in 1959 when Wisconsin expanded rights to some public employees. The This idea that public employees should have the right to bargain for wages and benefits was further legitimized through Executive Order 10988, signed by President Kennedy in 1962. This granted federal employees the right to collectively bargain. Uh, there was some hope as collective bargaining rights expanded throughout the states, as one state adopted them for firefighters, police officers, teachers, state employees, and other local employees like your garbage collectors or whatnot. As they expanded the right to collectively bargain to public employees, there was some hope that this would cut down on the number of strikes. So the 1960s especially saw an expansion of these rights throughout the states, 60s and early 70s, and a lot of states were dealing with striking teachers, striking garbage workers, striking public employees because of poor wages and benefits. And so there was a thought that if you give the public employees the right to collectively bargain, to come to the table, to negotiate these wages and benefits, then you might be able to prevent striking. And one of the things that was often included in these policies that granted collective bargaining rights to public employees were very strict penalties for striking. So it was kind of a trade-off. You get these rights at the table. You can now negotiate. You have the employers have the duty to bargain. You have to negotiate, meet and confer, and exchange proposals, and try to come to some negotiated agreement over wages and benefits and class sizes and other terms of employment, other working conditions. But in exchange, you give up the right to go on strike. And so as a result, because these policies had collective bargaining rights in them, and now formalized and legitimized that process for public employees, but at the cost of giving up the right to strike, the these policies actually had support from Democrats and Republicans in a lot of states. Not universally true. Some states did have strong opposition from mostly Republican politicians, but nonetheless, there was generally bipartisan support for a lot of these policies. So we saw with states adopting public sector collective bargaining rights, we saw a spike in unionization in the public sector. And so as public sector collective bargaining was on the rise, as public sector unions began to grow, at the same time, private sector unions were losing their power because of right-to-work laws that started to get enacted in states following the passage of Taft-Hartley. So you have public sector on the rise, private sector on the decline, and the situation we end up in today is that most unionized workers work in the public sector. Numbers-wise, it's relatively even, but percentage-wise, a higher percentage of public employees are unionized compared to the percentage of private sector employees. So the expansion of these rights was actually, in some cases, met with hostility from the labor unions. So, for example, the Taylor Law in New York was adopted in the 1970s and signed by late 1960s, and it was signed by Governor Rockefeller, a Republican. But when he signed the law, labor unions were against the law and then when they protested the law, even though that law established their collective bargaining rights, it also took away their right to strike or created very stiff penalties for striking. So this was a complicated expansion of these rights. When you then fast forward, as public sector unionization was on the rise, there became a backlash. So there was a perception that the public employee unions became too powerful and were holding local governments and state governments hostage in the collective bargaining process. And so a big turning point in American history, in American union history, is the PATCO strike. So by 1981, a lot of public employees were unionized and practicing their collective bargaining rights, and the PATCO union, which is the union for air traffic controllers, or was at the time, went on strike when Ronald Reagan was president. They actually supported Ronald Reagan in the 1980 election, and then they thought that they would be able to then work with him when it came to wages, benefits, working conditions. They wanted a pretty good pay raise and better working hours. And so they thought they came to the table with a pretty good bargaining position, in a pretty good position, and they found out the Reagan administration was not having it, and so they went on strike. They went on what at the time would have been an illegal strike. So they went on strike, and long story short, there's a lot of work written about this case. If you're interested, look up the PATCO union strike. But Ronald Reagan fired them all, fired all of the air traffic controllers, and busted the union. And this became a turning point in labor history, where politicians became emboldened to stand up to the power of public employee labor. And many of those striking workers, he fired them all, and many of those striking workers never came back to their jobs as air traffic controllers. By the time that they were allowed to do so, many of them had found other employment. I believe it was under Bill Clinton that the ones that were fired were allowed to come back, but that was about a decade later, and so many of them had moved on to other jobs. So that was a big turning point in the nation's attitude and politicians' reactions to public employee labor. So you fast forward to more recent reforms. What what has happened in the last decade or so. So, following the Great Recession, 2007, 2008, 2010, right in there, um, there became a large focus in budget deficits. And nationwide, the United States elected a lot of Tea Party Republicans, a lot of very conservative budget hawk Republicans, and these politicians started focusing their attention on curbing the power of public sector unions in their state, even in states where historically there was a strong public employee labor movement, a strong labor movement in general. So in the Midwest, uh, uh, states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, all started proposing bills to restrict public employee bargaining. So I want to discuss the arguments for and against these policies and what they are. So the argument for curbing public employee bargaining, taking away some of the rights of public employee unions. So there was the argument that labor unions had become too powerful, that they had wages that were too good and benefits that were Cadillac benefits. So they had really, really good benefits. Now, a lot of politicians pointed to, look, you are working in the private sector, and your wages aren't as high as this person in the public sector, who's got this really good pension and these good benefits and a good wage. And the argument was, why should the government be spending this kind of money when we don't spend this kind of money in the private sector on our employees? The alternative argument there, of course, is, well, if the government employees have good wages and benefits with the labor union, why aren't we trying to organize in the private sector or why aren't we making it easier to organize in the private sector to then raise the wages of private sector workers? That would be the union's response. But the argument for this policy is the public employee labor unions, their members are making too much money. They have really good benefits, and it's all taxpayer dollars. We come back to that first point, the first reason of opposition for to labor unions in the public sector, that you're not negotiating a private company's profits, you're negotiating for tax dollars. And oftentimes, people who want to restrict public employee labor union rights also discuss how members of labor unions can, when they're in the government, they can help elect the people that they're then negotiating with. It's like choosing your own boss. You don't get to go into work, choose your boss, and then negotiate wages and benefits and working conditions with that person. If you're a teacher, the argument goes, if you're a teacher, then you can help elect the school board. And if you don't like who's on the school board, you can help get them unelected. And then whoever you help get elected to the school board is then ultimately who has to sign off on the contract that you're negotiating. So ultimately, there's the argument that we're wasting taxpayer money when it comes to public employee labor unions. Labor unions push up wages, they raise wages and raise benefits. A lot of people who are against public employee unions acknowledge that unions push benefits up and push wages up. And their argument is that makes government inefficient. You're now paying more for teachers than you need to be paying for because the union is negotiating higher wages than the market would decide wages should be. That kind of thing. Same thing with police and firefighters. One of the big arguments that I found in my own research, actually, for these restrictions on collective bargaining rights is that following the Great Recession and budget deficits and local governments and state governments needing to get their finances in order, uh, proponents of restrictions of public employee labor unions argued that local governments need the tools necessary to be managers and to control their budgets. That the labor union contracts were keeping them from being fiscally responsible. That they needed the power to decide who to lay off, and rather than going by seniority, you get rid of the ineffective teachers, and you get rid of the ones that are costing you money and not doing their job. This is I put ineffective in quotes because it's sometimes debatable as to who's ineffective and who's not. How do you determine that? But either way, the argument is that managers need to be managers. They need the tools to manage their employees and make decisions that are good for the budget and good for the public and good for the taxpayers in turn. Arguments against these reforms. So besides what I mentioned earlier with, the public employees and their labor unions would argue that rather than be envious of their wages and benefits, we should be making it easier for the private sector to achieve the same wages and benefits as the employees in the public sector. So rather than drag them down, we should be lifting the private sector up with labor unions. That's what they would argue. They also argue that collective bargaining is a right, that employees have the right to stick together and bargain collectively with their employer for the best wages and benefits, and classroom sizes and the number of police officers on staff and safety equipment and stuff like that. That's a right that workers should have. They make the argument that, of course, labor unions build up the middle class, and also, in some cases, some of these reforms included police officers and firefighters, and especially in that case, like in Ohio in 2011, then the argument became that police officers and firefighters need to have collective bargaining rights because they know what's best for them protecting the public, that this was a public safety issue, that police officers should have a right to negotiate things like how many police officers are on staff at a time, how many police officers are in certain areas. They should be able to negotiate their safety equipment, same with firefighters. And so it becomes a public safety issue that you shouldn't leave it to politicians to decide dollars and cents what could end up costing us lives. One of the more important points that there's direct contention about is the impact of labor unions on state and local budgets. So people who are against these reforms that take away collective bargaining rights from public employees argue that these are just political attacks. They're political attacks. They're not about the budget. The Great Recession from the late 2000s messed up state and local budgets, not public employee collective bargaining, and that politicians are using this. They were, especially at that time, using fiscal responsibility as the excuse for going after a political opponent, because labor unions tend to support Democrats over Republicans. So the argument here is that this is just a political attack, and this is not something that's legitimately about dollars and cents and saving the taxpayers money. It has nothing to do with budget deficits. So there is some research that shows that there's a correlation between budget deficits and public employee collective bargaining and public employee rights, how powerful they are. But it's difficult to determine what's actually causing. There's a lot of question as to what has caused those budget deficits that's difficult to link directly to collective bargaining. So what's actually in these reforms? So there's a lot of moving parts in the reforms. Much of it looks like right to work. A lot of statements about collecting union dues and things like that. There are limits on the wages and benefits that you're allowed to negotiate. For example, the Wisconsin Act 10 made it so that public employees couldn't negotiate pay increases that went beyond the inflation increase in the consumer price index. So basically, that limited labor unions to negotiating what would amount to a cost of living increase. Anything over what the consumer price index said inflation was for that year would have to be voted on in a public referendum. Many of these restrictions set limits to how little public employees could contribute to their health care. So they would have to contribute at least X percentage to their health care. They couldn't negotiate anything lower or better for themselves than that. And one of the more interesting things that gets put into these reforms is the mechanisms for solving an impasse. So what happens when you've exchanged proposals, you're not getting anywhere, maybe you're doing mediation or arbitration to try and resolve disagreements in negotiations. Well, at an impasse, some of these reforms, if there's an impasse, then they're written up so that the employer gets to pick the last best offer. And so one of the criticisms of these reforms is that they maintain the collective bargaining process, but since they allow the employer to select the last best offer, it's all kind of a farce, because then the employer, if they just don't bargain in good faith, can just select their offer. So here's how that the criticism is about how that would work. I use teachers, right? The teachers give their proposal. Here's what we want. We want 3% increase for the next 3 years, plus no increase in our contributions to our health care. And the school board gives their proposal, and the school administration, so superintendent and that side of the table, they give their presentation, and they offer nothing. You have to pay more in health care. Instead of 15%, you're going to now pay 20% of your healthcare premium, and we're going to freeze your pay for the next 3 years. So it's not unusual for both sides to start with more extremes than they end up at. That's part of negotiating. But let's say hypothetically that's the case you're in. So if they don't budge, if neither side budges, and they don't solve this through mediation, and they don't have some kind of agreement with arbitration, then at the end of the process, at the end of going through the whole negotiation process, the employer, which in this case would be the school board, gets to choose the last best offer. So of course, if they just stand their ground and they don't budge throughout the entire negotiation, at the very end they know that they legally get to pick the last best offer. And to them, the last best offer is going to be their first offer of freezing pay for 3 years and having the teachers contribute more to their benefits. So the criticism here is that it's not really collective bargaining. It's what one politician in Ohio called collective begging. That the process is there, but at the end there's no real bargaining power to be had by the labor union. So to recap a little bit, one side blames public employees for wasteful spending and for impeding on workers' individual rights. That's part of this that also overlaps with the right to work issue. The other side frames this issue as an issue of rights and building up the middle class, and claims that a lot of these reforms to take away public sector collective bargaining rights are just political attacks on a political enemy. In another lecture, I'm going to dive a little bit farther into this issue, and we're going to talk specifically about the role of the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, in the spread of these reforms. Because the American Legislative Exchange Council is a conservative group that creates draft bills and then shops them to state legislatures. And they create draft bills about all kinds of issues, not just public employee labor, but public employee labor is one of the issues that they draft these bills on. And so there's some fascinating things going on with their influence over state legislatures, and I'll cover that in another time. Thank you.